I'd like to start going into some of the patterns of the elements as they relate to herbal medicine. So, as I was mentioning earlier, we do see the elements present in virtually every herbal system that I've come across. Ayurvedic medicine, they're there. Tibetan medicine, elements. Chinese medicine, elements. Galenic medicine, the traditional Greek model, built off of the elements. The Unani Tib system, Arabic system, built off of the elements. Even traditional North American herbalism, developed around the 1800s, 1800s, early 1900s, they still were using an elemental model. They weren't necessarily using the words earth, water, air, fire, but they're using terms like depression and excitation and heat and cold and dryness and everything like that. So they're still referring to those qualities of the elements. So even though it was a little bit different terminology, we still see that they were still using the elements as a foundation for how they understood their herbal medicines working, as well as how they would do their assessments of their clients and patients and things like that. So so they really do permeate across the whole world and spanning across the world and throughout time and tradition. The elements just pop up again and again and again. And they're one of those things that, you know, for me, I'll always be learning from the elements and always coming back to, because they just provide such a solid foundation of how life is put together. So when in herbal traditions, we see the elements influencing everything from their understanding of how nature is created, to how they understand the medicinal properties of their plants, to how they assess disease and someone's constitution. Those elements informed all of those different layers of practice. And so it's a super useful tool, very versatile tool. And that's why I really like the elemental model, like I said, because it's a good translation mechanism. You know, when I first started studying herbal medicine at Bastyr, the main way I was learning plants having their influence was based on their chemistry. Right, so it'd be like, oh, this herb works because, you know, it has these chemicals, and these chemicals work on these receptor sites, and it was like really reductionistic and really linear and like really hard to remember. But for something for me where it was like, oh, this person, like this condition is related to this element, and this herb is related to that element, and they fit together like that. It was like, oh, like that makes a lot more sense to me. And not saying we have to throw away the pharmacological model. That actually, the pharmacological model fits into our elemental model quite seamlessly, right? Because the chemicals in a plant are just one expression of those elements, right? And we see, you know, pungent, aromatic, essential oils oftentimes have that fire element in them. Those chemicals are just a physical means through which that element can work through, right, and influence our bodies. The other interesting thing about the elements in regards to constitutional systems and different systems of natural healing is that it would enable people to understand the effect of the seasons on our health, the effect of different kinds of weather on our health, the effects of foods that we eat on our health, etc. So we could see like, oh, this person, you know, when they have that joint pain, you know, maybe they get arthritis, like arthritic joint pain. Oh, it gets worse when the weather gets really cold and really damp. I say, oh, well, that's like a water element excess, right? The water element is aggravating that joint pain. And so they see like, oh, that joint pain is because of like water accumulating in the tissues, and it's swelling and it's pushing on the nerves and it's causing them to be a little more immobile and stiff. And so we see it's too much water. So it's a water kind of joint pain. But it can be very different from maybe someone has more of a dry joint pain. It gets worse when the weather gets really dry and hot, and all of a sudden their joints get kind of stiff and achy and kind of creaky and popping. And we say, oh, that's more of a dry kind of joint pain. It's more deficiency of water, right? So we can look at that pattern of excess and deficiency of the elements within someone's system, and that's a really useful way for kind of putting that together. So, oh, that was an excess of water. Oh, that one's a deficiency of water. That one's too much fire, too much warmth, or that one's too little fire, too lack of warmth. So we can look at each element in excess and in deficiency, and I go into a lot of detail on that in the in the online module there, and digging into each element in a lot more detail, a lot more detail than I'm going to go into today. We're just kind of hitting the big picture stuff to really anchor this elemental model into what you're doing. So I'd like to talk about organ systems, kind of elemental anatomy, so that you can see how the elements are influencing our physical organism, right? And kind of talked about the elements and their general correspondences to our kind of big picture anatomy, in the way that the earth is our physical body, the water is our emotions, the air is our thoughts and mind, and that fire is more that intuitive faculty, and then the ether is like our consciousness, right? So that's kind of the general model. But when we are just focusing on the physiological patterns, the elements can be a really useful way of breaking down the body and seeing how those elements influence how our body's put together. And in that way, that gives us a lot of helpful clues in regards to what types of elements might rule particular plants based on how those plants influence our physiology. So starting from the earth element, right? We've got our earth element. Remember, earth is the most fixed, the most solid, the most physical, the most dense, right? So what part of the body would you assume the earth element might rule? The bones, absolutely, yeah, because they're the most dense part of the body. In general, calcium is ruled by the earth element, as well as Saturn as the most, it's like one of the building blocks for the structural component of the body, being bones, connective tissue, i.e. tendons, ligaments, cartilage, the teeth as well. These are all ruled by the earth element, because it provides that solid foundation that basically constitutes the bulk, or not the bulk, but the foundation for our physical frame. So the bones are ruled by the earth element. Also see that some systems correspond the liver to the earth element, because the liver's a very hard-working organ. It's everything that you put into your body, your liver has to deal with at some point. So it's a very practical organ. In medical astrology, the liver is ruled by the sign of Virgo, which is an earth element sign. And so the liver's very practical, right? It basically has to be extremely organized and taking in, you figure, you eat a meal, right? You swallow it, you digest it. The minute all of that stuff crosses the gut wall, all the nutrients, any of the toxins, anything that is in your digestive tract, crosses the gut wall, it goes through the portal vein. And the portal vein is one of the largest veins in the body. And it basically takes everything from the digestive system and brings it into the liver. And so they say the liver receives all of this, quote, dirty blood. Dirty is not that's the way some of my teachers refer to it. Dirty in the sense that it's just got a bunch of stuff in it, right? And so the liver has to take in all of that stuff and sort it, organize it, unpack it, repack it, flag it, bag it, tag it, figure out where in the body it's going to go. And it's like a big shipping warehouse, right? So it receives all this stuff, it has to organize it, figure out where it's supposed to go, what it's supposed to do, maybe further metabolize it, and then determine and then ship it out to the rest of the body. So it's like that earth element, really practical, really organized, really structured in the way that it does things, right? And the way that it's processing pretty much much everything physical that you put into your body. Okay, so the earth element relates to the liver. The spleen also has been related to the earth element. That also is related through the astrology, and that Saturn also rules the spleen. Saturn and the earth element are kind of similar. They both are very structural kind of qualities. And then, so those are our main earth element rulerships. In the water element, we see the kidneys and the lymphatic system are the main organ rulerships there. So the whole genitourinary tract, so that would be kidneys, bladder, and all the connecting tubes, so the ureters, the urethra, that kind of is what constitutes the urinary tract. Obviously, makes sense, right, that the urinary tract would govern the water element. The whole function of the kidneys is to maintain the solid to liquid balance, and it does that through mineral exchange. And so the kidneys are constantly regulating, okay, how much water do we hold in? How much water do we let out? What's our ratio of sodium and potassium? How dilute does that ratio need to be? And it'll adjust as needed. So it's constantly balancing solids and liquids. That's why in astrology, the kidneys are ruled by Libra, the scales, the sign of balance. That's why we got two of them, right, on either side of the body. Two kidneys to keep that balance. Now, and I'll throw a little astrology in there just to prep you for it the other day. We'll go through the anatomy again, through the signs and through the planets when we talk about astrology in a little more depth, if y'all are interested in that. The lymphatic system, so the lymphatic tissue permeates throughout the entire body, right? So the lymphatic system is like the great filter of the body. It's cleansing. It's like the inner ocean. That's why lymphatics are ruled by Pisces, the sign of the fish. That's the inner ocean. So it's cleansing the waters of the body. A lot of our immune system is present in the lymphatics. That's why it's like when you get sick, sometimes you get that swollen lymph node. It's because there's all this like dead bacteria, dead viral cells, dead immune cells that the lymphatic tissue is picking up and trying to cleanse and detoxify, but sometimes it gets overwhelmed and it all stagnates, and then you get that swollen node. So you generally take, movement is the best remedy for the lymph. The lymph can't move on its own. It requires our movement for it to move because it doesn't have its own pump. But then we have lymphatic herbs that can help move stuck lymph like that. So kidneys, urinary tract, lymphatics, also the mucosal membranes. These are this is not so much an organ, but a tissue type. So the mucosal membranes line all of the organs that are exposed to the outside world. So the lungs, respiratory system, the digestive system, and the urinary tract. And we have to imagine these are entryways into the body, right? These are ways things can get into the body. And so these mucosal membranes secrete this mucus that's very rich in antibodies and immunological factors as protection. So I kind of think of, it's kind of nerdy, but I kind of think of the mucosal membranes, it's like a moat, you think of like the old castles, and they got like that protective moat around it so things can't get in. That's really what our mucosal membranes are like. It's like this protective water, right, that's coating all these organs that open up to the outside world. So anything gets in, the water traps it there, and then the immune system can take care of it locally without it getting deeper into the system and causing problems. So those mucosal membranes, protective waters of the body, also ruled by the water element. And of course we have all of the just fluids in general, tears, the plasma portion of the blood being related to water. And then we have the reproductive system. So they say the waters of life, specifically the uterus has a strong relationship to the water element, but in general, the reproductive system of both men and women tends to relate to the water element. All the reproductive fluids relate to the water element. And that makes sense, right? Because everything is born of water, right? We were all born from water, the way we grew in our mother's womb, right? And we're suspended in that watery solution, right? That all the nutrients in there. So we're all born from water, and that's kind of the way they say, life was born too. When we look at biological evolution, what biology says, that everything was born from water, right? That life first sprang out of the ocean, right? It was like first life forms, like these algae life forms that ultimately evolved and came onto the land and ultimately learned to photosynthesize and turned into plants, and everything kind of grew out of that water element. And if we look at a lot of mythologies, right? We look at mythological systems. What do they talk about? The primordial ocean, right? They talk about the primordial ocean. Even the book of Genesis, they say, the wind swept across the waters, right? And then life was born out of the water, right? The earth element was born out of water, right? So spirit moves down through the fire, the air, and the water. So the water, it's like the fire is in the air, the fire and air is in the water, the fire, air, and water is in the earth. So everything physical, everything material was born out of water. That's why we're born from water in our mother's womb. That's why they say biological evolution, everything came from water. So that reproductive system, that creation, that water of life is a part of that, and I think that's why we have to drink water, to live, And that's why we all need to really take care of our water element as a whole, all that, the whole big movement going on, with the water protectors and everything going on with the pipeline, and that's why people are really standing up for that, because a lot of people say, well, that's a native land, it doesn't really concern me. It's like, well, there's only one water. When you poison one water, we poison all water, because we're all connected through water. Most of our body is water, right? Most of this planet Earth is water. So water is everything, and we're all connected through that water. So that's why, I feel like a big part of what it means to be a conscious human being these days is really being mindful with our water element, taking care of our water. It's really, really important, because that's life. So just a little bit on the water element. I love the water element a lot. It's maybe it's because I have 4 planets in Pisces. So then we have our air element. Air element. So what organ system would you say was going to relate to the air element?
Brain.
Yeah, the brain and the mind. Now, if we're looking at a 4-element system, that would be true. If we're using a 5-element system, the ether element would more rule the brain and the nervous system. The respiratory system, right? So breathing, that air element, when we take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. But it's also, and we have to remember with the body, we have our organ systems present on kind of the bigger level, but then there's there's like a microcosm of all the organ systems. So each cell has its own respiratory system. Each cell takes in oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide travels to the lungs and is expelled, and we breathe more in. So we have the respiratory system as a whole, but then you have cellular respiration happening as well. So the air element there, we think air is mediation between the outer and the inner, and that's what's happening with our breath, right? And that's why they say the lungs are also ruled by Mercury, that mediator between the inner and the outer, the above and the below. It's that bridge. And that's why, like I was saying earlier, our breath is one of the best ways to kind of connect our consciousness and our body, to connect our inner world to the plant, to calm our mind and our nervous systems through the air. So yeah, lungs, respiratory system, also the large intestine. I say the large intestine is very much so associated with the air element. That's why the large intestine is very prone to gaseousness, right? The air element can accumulate in there, and as you get that gas, that wind imbalance in the colon, but it also has to move, right? The air element is all about movement, and the health of the colon is utterly dependent on everything staying moving in there. Also, lungs and large intestine, they say reflex to one another. So oftentimes through the air element. So sometimes if people have issues in their lungs, it can also reflex and affect the colon and vice versa. So sometimes when people have colon issues, that's why if anyone's ever like smoked tobacco, you can see that connection pretty quickly between the lungs and the colon. So a lot of times people, smoke tobacco and immediately they have to go poop, right? Because it's stimulating the colon and moving everything along. But that's connected in Ayurvedic medicine too, through the Vata dosha rules the lungs and the colon. And also the nervous system too. So if we're taking a 4-element model, the air element's going to rule the nerves and the brain and the mind. That's why you see too, like if you've ever gotten constipated in your colon, you feel it in your head. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced that, but that happened to me one time where I've never been constipated before, but I was like trying to do a cleanse in my early 20s, and I was like, yeah, psyllium husk, and I took a bunch of psyllium husk, and I don't think I drank enough water with it or something, or maybe it just doesn't agree with my system, but man, it really backed me up for days, and the whole time I just was like, so foggy in my head, and I usually feel like I've got a pretty crisp mind, like I feel usually pretty sharp, but I just was like, oh my God, like I can't think clearly at all. And I was like, what is going on? And I was like, oh, it's that air element is stagnant, right? It's not moving. So the reflexes, this is why understanding elemental anatomy like this is really cool, because it starts to connect different parts of the body that from just looking at it on a physical side, they may not seem like, you talk to any anatomist and you're like, yeah, the colon and the lungs are connected. Be like, what? Like the lungs are about breathing and oxygenation. Colon is about pooping, and absorbing water, right? There's not any connection there, but everything's connected in the body, right? Everything is interconnected. So when we kind of pull back and have more of this energetic understanding of how our bodies are put together, these different kind of elemental clays that form our organ systems, you can see kind of how different things are interconnected. So when someone comes to you and maybe they have complaints in their large intestine and in their lungs and in their mind, it's like, oh, we can immediately see the air element is imbalanced. So that's where we need to work. Does that make sense? I think that's a really cool thing about elemental anatomy. I did forget to mention the water element also relates to the stomach. And as well to the breasts, specifically in women, the breasts and the stomach, the fluids that are generated there, and just the importance of those fluids. And then fire element relates to the heart and the cardiovascular system and the blood. So the fire, the way it moves, the way the fire kind of moves up and out and dances, right, and is constantly moving, same way our blood needs to move. Also just the color, that red color of our blood, the red color of the fire, and the way the heart is in the middle, in the center of our system. And the way the sun is at the center of the solar system and everything orients around that sun. It's the same way in our body. Right, the sun is shining its light throughout the whole universe, or at least our solar system, right? The sun's shining out through our whole solar system, touching everything with that light and that life. That's what our heart does, right? Our heart is shining out its light in the form of blood, and that blood touches every cell of our body, every organ, every tissue of our body, and gives as the disseminator of life, right? Is the heart. So it relates to the fire element like that. And then the immune system, right? Our immune system, the protection of the body. Think what happens when your immune system gets activated. What tends to happen? You start to get sick. You get fever, right? The fever is that fire element turning on, right? And it's governed by the hypothalamus, the higher regulatory center of the brain. But what the hypothalamus does is it closes the pores of the skin and then increases the internal body temperature. And so that's why you feel really hot with the fever. So it's that, and the whole function, right, is that it's a brilliant response, right, of the body, that the immune system will read the bacteria or the virus or whatever it is that's making you sick, and it'll send that signal to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will raise your body temperature to the exact temperature that's needed to denature the protein structure of that virus or that bacteria. Right? And so they've shown different pathogens require a certain temperature to denature their proteins, right? To kill them, basically. And that the immune system, our body is so smart, it can like read that and be like, all right, we need a 104 or a 106 or something. And so that set point will be determined by the intelligence of the immune system in conjunction with the hypothalamus. So that fire element relates to immunity. It's our protection, right? It's the way protection happens. So fever is one of those immunological responses related to fire, but also inflammation, right? The inflammatory response is related to the fire element as well. And again, it's another one of those brilliant physiological mechanisms of our body that oftentimes is seen as the enemy. And we're like, no, inflammation's bad. The whole problem is inflammation. But no, inflammation's not bad. It's actually good. It's just when it becomes excessive and imbalanced that it can be bad. So, and then the small intestine. So a lot of heat in the small intestine, and a lot of stuff going on in the small intestine, right? We got acids and enzymes, pancreatic enzymes, bile, all these digestive juices that are breaking things down, right? That's what's going on in the small intestine. It's breaking your foodstuffs down into their constituents where they can be absorbed and enter into the liver for further processing. So there's a lot of heat, a lot of fire element in the small intestine. And they say small intestine tends to reflex to the heart. So there's a reflex there through the fire element there. So let's see here. Just kind of going through. Yeah. Okay. So and then lastly, and then fire element also was muscles. The musculature of the body relates to that fire element too. And then lastly, we have the ether element. That predominantly would relate to the nervous system, the brain, consciousness. As ether is like the space within which all of the other four elements manifest. So ether is space that the water flows and the earth grows and the air blows and the fire shines and so the nervous system's kind of like that too, where the nervous system innervates pretty much every tissue and organ of the body, and some organs it doesn't, like the nervous system doesn't directly influence like the liver or the kidneys, but what it does control is the blood vessels. So when the nervous system contracts, it can constrict those blood vessels and reduce how much blood those organs get, which is going to radically determine their functioning. So in the same way that ether is like the space, the container that determines how the other elements will function, the same is true with like the nervous system. It's a regulatory system of the body. And so the nerves are constantly overseeing and regulating everything, as is the brain. So that tends to be how I think of the ether element, and kind of representing that nucleus of the cell, the center, the consciousness and everything. So that's how I think of elemental anatomy, and it's a really useful way when you're working with someone. You kind of sit there and you're kind of thinking about these relationships, and you all see how that makes sense, right? I mean, it makes sense that how the heart and fire are connected, and how our lymphatics and mucosal membranes relate to the water, and how the liver relates to the earth, and how the lungs relate to air. I mean, it just makes sense, so much sense, that all of our organ systems have such a clear relationship to these elemental forces. So I like to talk about that because it really shows pretty clearly how our whole physical makeup is constituted by these elemental forces that determine how our physiology functions, and how our physiology can malfunction too, and how we'll talk a little later about how elements can get within certain organs and create an imbalance. So if you think of like the water element in the air element, well, that can be like a really moist, damp, wet cough. So now it's like the water is attacking the air and creating this imbalance. So you can kind of start to overlap your organ rulerships of what element rules an organ, and then look at the specific state of the tissues in that organ and what element is related there. And then you start bringing your plants together to balance those elemental forces within the organ system. I mean, to me, it's just like a really simple way of understanding the body and herbs, but it works really well. I mean, this is how herbalism was practiced for millennia, right? Just through this elemental kind of model. And it is very simple, but it is very effective and very profound. And I say you can, build an entire practice of herbal medicine just using the elements like this. So, so with that, we'll take any questions before we have lunch here. Yeah.
Did you mention somewhere that the liver was part of the fire element?
Well, the liver can be. Some people do relate fire to liver in the sense that it's a very metabolically active organ. Like the liver is really busy, so it is a hot organ. They do say it's one of the warmer organs of the body, and it can be prone to heat imbalances. So yeah, some systems do relate the fire element to the liver because of that, because it's so busy and so active, basically. Yeah. I tend to think of it more as the earth, though.
Okay.
Yeah. And because one of the major issues a lot of folks have with their liver tends to be like stagnation, like kind of that thing, and energy gets stuck there, it's just stuckness tends to be related to earth. There's other cases where it's not, but for the most part, it can be kind of like a too much accumulation, too much things building up in there. Yeah. Yeah, Armando.
Experience and see how it relates to the elements. When I moved here last spring, it was super rainy here, very wet, and I noticed that I started to urinate a lot all day and wake up a few times during the night.
Yeah.
And then I was always hot.
Huh.
Like always burning up to the touch. I would do a cold shower and it was still hot.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a really great way of assessing like your own elemental balance, right? And so oftentimes if your system's not used to being in a really wet place like that, and it's all of a sudden being exposed to more water than it's used to, it's probably going to want to throw off that excess water, hence the additional urination during the day, and then the heat, right? So we oftentimes see, because the elements never exist in isolation. It's actually impossible for the elements to exist in isolation. They only exist in relationship with one another. And so that's typically what we see in a person, is usually combinations of the elements interacting with one another. So kind of what you're talking about, like this excess dampness and moisture along with heat, right? So it'd be like in Chinese medicine, they would call that like a damp heat pattern, which is a pretty common pattern that we see there. So then you just want to incorporate things to kind of dry and cool the system down. Yeah. 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 Any other questions? Awesome. Is that helpful? Elemental anatomy. I like to hit that one because it's a really good overview of this elemental model, and it's kind of one of the main ways that I use the elements, right? And it's kind of thinking through the person and some of the correspondences there. And after lunch, we'll talk about more of these relationships with plants, and probably we're doing pretty good on time, so maybe be able to take a little plant walk today and walk around and look at elemental signatures in plants. It's an awesome way to really start to see how the elements are moving through nature, are moving through the plant, so we can see, oh right, that's what fire element looks and feels like, and oh maybe that's more earth element qualities, etc. So